Welcome to S&C's podcast series, S&C Critical Insights. I'm Eric Kadel, co-head of S&C's Foreign Investments and Trade Regulations practice.
And I'm Chris Mann, Eric's co-head of the practice.
And I'm Manon Scales. I work closely with Eric and Chris on foreign investment matters.
Today we'll be talking about a few very important developments in the area of foreign investment and national security. First,
at 3 minutes and 30 seconds in the recording,
we'll discuss a CFIUS proposal that would revise the rules that apply to mandatory filings with CFIUS for transactions that involve critical technology. These rules are not yet effective, but written comments on the proposed rule are due by June 22, and it appears that Treasury intends to move quickly in adopting final rules. Second, we'll talk about how national security concerns have motivated developments in two specific sectors, telecommunications and power, that reinforce the current administration's focus on the national security risks posed by foreign investment in the United States in industries and sectors that are considered especially sensitive or prone to foreign infiltration or sabotage. In telecommunications, we'll talk first
at 9 minutes and 26 seconds in the recording,
about Executive Order 13873, entitled Securing the Information and Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain, and the regulations proposed to implement it. Then,
at 21 minutes and 35 seconds in the recording,
we'll discuss Executive Order 13913, or the Executive Order on establishing the Committee for the Assessment of Foreign Participation in the United States Telecommunications Services Sector, which was issued on April 4 of this year and formalizes, through the establishment of a committee, the ad hoc working group known as Team Telecom, which has been reviewing certain telecommunications transactions that fall under the jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission. Finally, at
29 minutes and 48 seconds in the recording,
we'll talk about Executive Order 13920, Securing the United States Bulk Power System, issued on May 1, and to authorize restrictions on bulk power system electric equipment if there is a connection to a foreign adversary that poses an unacceptable risk to the national security of the United States or other risks to the U.S. economy or safety. With that introduction, I'll turn first to the discussion of the mandatory filings to get us started. Under current law, there are two instances in which filing with CFIUS may be mandatory. First, any covered transaction that results in the acquisition of a substantial interest in a TID U.S. business, TID. And the TID stands for Technology, Infrastructure, or Data, by a foreign person in which the national or subnational governments of a single foreign state, other than an accepted foreign state, and currently that's a very limited set, have a substantial interest. The second is any covered transaction or a transaction subject to CFIUS jurisdiction that is a covered investment in or that could result in foreign control of a TID U.S. business that produces, designs, tests, manufactures, fabricates, or develops one or more critical technologies utilized by the TID U.S. business in, or designed by the TID U.S. business for use in, one or more of 27 industries that are identified by NAICS code in the CFIUS regulations. Any person who fails to make that mandatory filing may be liable for a civil penalty of up to $250,000 per violation, or the value of the transaction. The proposed rules would make two significant changes. First, for mandatory filings that are triggered because a foreign state would have a substantial interest, in other words, the first category of mandatory filing, the proposed rule would modify the definition of substantial interest to make changes that are in the nature of a clarification and elimination of a potential loophole. Let me explain. Under the current rule, a substantial interest is defined to mean a voting interest, direct or indirect, of 25% or more by a foreign person in the TID U.S. business, and a voting interest, direct or indirect, of 49% or more by a single foreign government, which includes both national and subnational governments, including their respective departments, agencies, and instrumentalities, in a foreign person. There's a clarification in the regulations that for entities with a general partner, so typically an investment fund, or a managing member or an equivalent to a general partner, the regulations provide that the national or subnational governments of a single foreign state will be considered to have a substantial interest in the entity only if they hold 49% or more of the interest in the general partner, managing member, or equivalent of the entity. The proposed rule from CFIUS clarifies that for this special rule to apply, it's not enough for an entity to have a general partner, managing member, or equivalent. The entity's activities must be primarily directed, controlled, or coordinated by or on behalf of that general partner, managing member, or equivalent. This change appears to be directed at closing a potential loophole where a GP, a managing member, or the equivalent doesn't have the authority that's typically afforded to that position. The proposed rule would also clarify an attribution rule in the current regulations. That rule is currently stated as, for purposes of determining the percentage of voting interest held indirectly by one entity in another, any voting interest of a parent will be deemed to be a 100% voting interest in any entity of which it is a parent. The proposed rule eliminates the reference to voting, so the provision would read, for purposes of determining the percentage of delete voting interest held indirectly by one entity in another entity, any, again, delete voting interest of a parent will be deemed to be a 100%. Finally, delete voting a third time, interest in any entity of which it is a parent. So those are the changes that are made with respect to the first mandatory filing category. The second mandatory filing category, the mandatory filing requirement associated with critical technology U.S. businesses, is being modified in a way that eliminates the nexus to a specific NAICS code. That nexus is going to be replaced, if the proposed rules are adopted, with a requirement that the critical technologies have a nexus to one of the four main U.S. export control regimes. Those are administered by the Departments of Commerce, Energy, and State, and by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Under the proposed regulations, a transaction would trigger a mandatory filing if the U.S. business would be required to obtain a U.S. government authorization, license, or other approval to export, re-export, transfer in country, or retransfer the critical technology to the foreign investor. Notification to CFIUS would be mandatory even if a license exemption may be available under the State Department's International Traffic in Arms regulations or subject to a few exceptions, the Commerce Department's Export Administration regulations. The exceptions are for a few of the license exemptions that apply under the EAR, and that will eliminate the need for a mandatory filing, assuming that's the only reason for the mandatory filing. In other words, if the U.S. business would need U.S. government authorization or license to export the critical technology to the controlling foreign persons involved in the transaction, or certain controlling foreign persons in the ownership chain, then filing with CFIUS is mandatory. Treasury explained that this proposal is going to leverage the national security foundations of the export control regimes, which require licensing or authorization in certain cases based on an analysis of the particular item and end user and the particular foreign country. Treasury is accepting comments on the proposed rules until June 22, but this change has been in the works for a while, and the proposed rule likely will be adopted soon in a form materially similar to the proposal. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris to start our discussion of the changes impacting the telecommunications sector.
Thanks, Eric. President Trump issued Executive Order 13873 on May 15th of last year. The order authorized the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the heads of other appropriate agencies, to impose measures to mitigate national security concerns with respect to transactions that would otherwise be prohibited pursuant to the order. And we'll explain both the executive order and the Commerce Department regulations. The executive order found that foreign adversaries are increasingly creating and exploiting vulnerabilities in information and communications technology and services, referred to as ICTS, for Information and Communications Technology and Services, in order to commit malicious cyber-enabled actions against the United States, such as economic and industrial espionage. The executive order also found that the unrestricted acquisition or use in the United States of ICTS that is designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons or entities owned or controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction of a foreign adversary, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. We'll refer to these persons or entities simply as foreign adversaries throughout this podcast. Pursuant to his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the National Emergencies Act, the President declared this threat a national emergency and prohibited certain transactions involving ICTS designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by foreign adversaries. There are a number of factors that determine whether a transaction is prohibited by the order. First, there must be an acquisition, importation, transfer, installation, dealing in, or use of ICTS by a person or with respect to property that is subject to U.S. jurisdiction. For purposes of the order, ICTS is defined as any hardware, software, or other product or service primarily intended to fulfill or enable the function of information or data processing, storage, retrieval, or communication by electronic means, including transmission, storage, and display. That's a direct quote. Second, a foreign adversary must have an interest in the transaction. The order isn't precise as to exactly what is sufficient to constitute an interest of a foreign adversary in a transaction, but the order notes that interest would include an interest in a contract for the provision of the technology or service. Next, the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the heads of a laundry list of other executive departments and agencies, including the Secretaries of Treasury, State, and Defense, the Attorney General, and the Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, must make two determinations. First, that the transaction involves ICTS designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by a foreign adversary. Second, that the transaction does any of the following three things. 1, poses an undue risk of sabotage to or subversion of ICTS in the United States. 2, poses an undue risk of catastrophic effects on the security or resiliency of U.S. critical infrastructure or the U.S. digital economy. Or 3, otherwise poses an unacceptable risk to U.S. national security. Finally, the prohibition applies to any transaction that was initiated, is pending, or will be completed after the date of the order. The order authorizes the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the heads of other appropriate agencies, to impose measures to mitigate national security concerns with respect to transactions that would otherwise be prohibited pursuant to the order. This is similar to the mitigation authority exercised by CFIUS with respect to certain foreign investments that raise national security concerns. The order also included continuing assessment and reporting requirements for the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the Secretary of Commerce. Finally, the order required the Secretary of Commerce, again in consultation with the heads of numerous other agencies, to publish regulations implementing the order within 150 days following the date of the order. Before I turn it over to Manon to discuss the proposed regs, I'd note more broadly that this executive order really marked the beginning of a regulatory push to place restrictions on foreign involvement in the U.S. telecommunications sector. Although there is nothing explicit in the order, the general understanding was that the order was intended primarily to target the large Chinese telecommunications company Huawei, which was at the time and remains the subject of 2 indictments by the Department of Justice, alleging, among other things, theft of trade secrets, obstruction of justice, and violations of U.S. sanctions with respect to Iran. The day after the issuance of the order, the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industrial Security, or BIS, added Huawei and 68 of its international affiliates to the entity list, which imposed licensing requirements on the export, re-export, or in-country transfer to Huawei or any of its listed affiliates of all items subject to the Export Administration Regulations. BIS added an additional 46 international Huawei affiliates to the entity list in August 2019. A limited temporary general license is currently in place to assure the continued operation of portions of U.S. telecommunications systems while allowing time for affected U.S. parties to shift to other sources of equipment, software, and technology, but exports or transfers to Huawei and its listed affiliates generally remain subject to broad licensing requirements and a presumption of denial in the review of any licensed application. In addition, on November 22, 2019, the Federal Communications Commission issued an order identifying Huawei and another Chinese telecommunications company, ZTE Corporation, as national security threats, and barring the use of any funds from the FCC's Universal Service Fund, which is a fund used to subsidize purchases to support the establishment of communications infrastructure, to purchase equipment and services from either company. With that background, I'll turn it over to Manon to discuss the next development, the issuance of proposed regulations to implement Executive Order 13873.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris noted earlier, Executive Order 13873 gave the Commerce Department 150 days to issue implementing regulations. Commerce ran a bit late, but issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on November 27th of 2019, proposing regulations that would establish what the issuing release referred to as a case-by-case, fact-specific review process by which the Secretary of Commerce will determine whether a particular transaction should be mitigated or prohibited. The proposed regulations would retain the order's broad definition of a transaction that Chris mentioned earlier, that is, any acquisition, importation, transfer, installation, dealing in, or use of any ICTS. With respect to the applicability of the new framework, the proposed regulations would allow the Secretary to initiate an evaluation regardless of when any contract applicable to the transaction was executed, or when any license, permit, or authorization applicable to the transaction was granted. So, for example, purchases made via purchase order under a long-standing contract would be subject to evaluation regardless of when the master contract was entered into. Similarly, the proposed regulations would also clarify that transactions involving certain ongoing activities, such as managed services, software updates, or repairs, would constitute transactions that were completed on or after May 15th, 2019, the date of the order, even if a contract was entered into prior to that date. The Secretary would be permitted to initiate an evaluation of a transaction in 3 specific circumstances. First, at the Secretary's discretion. Second, upon the written request of any government department or agency, governmental body, or the Federal Acquisition Security Council. And third, based on information submitted by private parties that the Secretary determines to be credible. Once the Secretary has conducted an evaluation and made a preliminary determination that a transaction meets the criteria set forth in the order that Chris discussed earlier, the Secretary will provide written notice to the parties to that transaction. And the parties would then have 30 days to submit an opposition along with any supporting information, and the parties may also propose measures for mitigation. Taking into account any comments and information received from the parties to the transaction, the Secretary would then have 30 days to make a final written determination that the transaction is prohibited, the transaction is not prohibited, or that mitigation will be required as a precondition to approval of the transaction. The proposed regulations would also subject parties to civil penalties for violations of the regulations or mitigation measures negotiated thereunder, for making any false or misleading representations, statements, or certifications, or for falsifying or concealing any material facts. In addition to the fairly high-level summary of the proposed regulations that I just provided, I also wanted to highlight a few notable features of the order and the proposed regulations, particularly for those of us who have some familiarity with the CFIUS review process. First, similar to the CFIUS process, Commerce would have the power under the proposed regulations to evaluate completed transactions and require after the fact mitigation, or in some cases, the unwinding of the transaction. However, in contrast to the CFIUS framework, where the parties generally get the benefit of a safe harbor that protects the transaction from further review once it's received formal CFIUS approval, the proposed regulations would specifically provide that the Secretary of Commerce will not issue advisory opinions or declaratory rulings with respect to particular transactions, and that the Secretary may reevaluate a previously reviewed transaction if circumstances, technology, or available information has materially changed. Also, although Commerce declined to do so in the currently proposed regulations, the regulations would provide that Commerce may in the future determine that certain classes of transactions, as opposed to individual transactions, are prohibited, which would, at least for those transactions, eliminate the case-by-case fact-specific analysis that's currently contemplated by the proposed regulations and that parties are used to under the CFIUS framework. Comments on the proposed regulations were initially due by December 27th of last year, though Commerce extended the deadline to January 10th, 2020. We haven't seen a final rule or any further action yet, which is not entirely surprising given the extraordinary circumstances of the past few months, but we do expect further developments to come relatively soon, especially in light of the current administration's focus on foreign investment and specifically in the telecom industry. And that provides a nice segue for me to turn it back over to Eric to discuss a more recent executive order that also relates to foreign participation in the U.S. telecom industry.
Thank you, Manon. Another significant development in the telecom sector is that on April 4 of this year, President Trump issued Executive Order 13913, which formalized the review processes of an informal interagency working group that's known as Team Telecom. Team Telecom's primary function has been to evaluate for potential national security and law enforcement issues certain types of license applications that are submitted to the FCC by foreign parties. What's happened is that the FCC has essentially delegated a role in assessing those matters on the basis of expertise to the Team Telecom agencies, which has historically included representatives from the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense for input that the FCC then takes into consideration in making its decision in respect of the license application submitted to the FCC. As I mentioned, the Team Telecom historically included representatives of Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. Each of those are retained under the new executive order as part of the new committee, but the executive order also identifies other government entities to serve as committee advisors, including the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Commerce, the Director of National Intelligence, the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. The order formally names what was colloquially referred to as Team Telecom, the Committee for the Assessment of Foreign Participation in the United States Telecommunications Services Sector. The executive order makes the Attorney General the chair of the committee, although similar to the CFIUS process, the Attorney General may designate one or more lead members to perform certain functions throughout the review process. Consistent with Team Telecom's historical purpose, the order tasks the committee with, upon referral by the FCC, reviewing and assessing license applications to determine whether granting a license or the transfer of a license poses a risk to national security or law enforcement interests of the United States. In addition to reviewing license applications, the order also authorizes the committee to review existing licenses to identify any additional or new risks to national security or law enforcement interests of the United States. The order doesn't prescribe the types of applications or licenses that the committee is to review. Instead, consistent with the historical practice, the committee will review applications referred to it by the FCC. In the case of existing licenses, the committee appears to have broad discretion. No FCC referral is required. Similar to the CFIUS framework, the order establishes timing requirements for each phase of the committee's review. The committee's initial review must be completed within 120 days of the date that the chair determines the applicant's responses to any questions from the committee are complete. As in the CFIUS process, the Director of National Intelligence is required to provide the committee with a threat assessment that incorporates the views of the intelligence community, including the CIA, the NSA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. During the review period, the committee may make one of three determinations. First, that granting an application raises no current risk to national security or law enforcement interests. Second, that any identified risk to national security or law enforcement interest raised by an application may be addressed through standard mitigation measures recommended by the committee. Or third, that a secondary assessment of an application is warranted because risk to national security or law enforcement interests cannot be mitigated by standard mitigation measures. Any secondary assessment of an application must be completed within 90 days after the determination that a secondary assessment is warranted. The order differentiates between standard mitigation measures and non-standard mitigation measures, but does not substantively define those terms. We expect that additional color will be given to this distinction in the required memorandum of understanding among the participating agencies in the new committee. Returning to the review process, once the committee has made a determination with respect to a license application, the committee will take one of three actions. First, the committee may advise the FCC that the committee has no objection to the FCC granting the license or transfer of the license. Second, the committee may recommend that the FCC deny the application due to the risk to the national security or law enforcement interests of the United States. Or third, the committee may recommend that the FCC only grant the license or transfer contingent on the applicant's compliance with mitigation measures. Similarly, where the committee has made a determination with respect to an existing license, the committee may recommend that the FCC modify the license to include a condition of compliance with mitigation measures negotiated by the committee. They may recommend that the FCC revoke the license due to the risks to national security or law enforcement interests of the United States, or they may take no action with respect to that license, just leave it in place, essentially. Consistent with the CFIUS framework, any recommendation made with respect to a license application or existing license must be based on a written risk-based analysis. While the order requires the committee to try to reach consensus on all recommendations, unlike the CFIUS process, which operates by member consensus, if consensus cannot be reached with respect to a particular recommendation, the committee members will determine the recommendation by majority vote. If the committee intends to recommend denial or revocation of a license or modification or approval conditioned on compliance with non-standard mitigation measures, the committee is required to consult with the committee advisors and allow the advisors 21 days in which to oppose the recommendation. If any of the committee advisors opposes the recommendation, the committee members and committee advisors, first through designees and then through the heads of the agencies themselves, are required to confer and attempt to reach consensus. But if no consensus is reached, the committee members will determine the recommendation by majority vote, and the committee must notify the president of the intended recommendation and the opposition thereto from committee members and advisors. Finally, the committee will be responsible for monitoring licensee compliance with any mitigation measures imposed by the FCC as a condition of the license, and in cases of non-compliance, may recommend modification or revocation of that license. The committee members and the DNI, or the Director of National Intelligence, are required to enter into a memorandum of understanding within 90 days of the date of the order. So we'll expect to see something in the next month or two. The memorandum of understanding should provide additional clarity around this formalized review process, in particular with respect to mitigation measures, and also with respect to the questions and information requests that applicants or licensees should expect to have to respond to if their application or license is referred or selected for review. So that ends the discussion of changes impacting the telecommunications sector. Let me turn it over to Chris to discuss the executive order to restrain international sourcing for U.S. bulk power system. In other words, the national security changes impacting the energy sector.
Thanks, Eric. On May 1st of this year, President Trump issued Executive Order 13920, Securing the United States Bulk Power System, which authorizes restrictions on bulk power system electric equipment if there's a connection to a foreign adversary that poses an unacceptable risk to the national security of the United States or other risks to the U.S. economy or safety. Executive Order 13920 is similar to Executive Order 13873 of May 15, 2019 in the communications sector. In this case, the President found that foreign adversaries are increasingly creating and exploiting vulnerabilities in the United States bulk power system, which provides the electricity that supports our national defense, vital emergency services, critical infrastructure, economy, and way of life. The bulk power system, the President stated, is a target of those seeking to commit malicious acts against the United States and its people, including malicious cyber activities, because a successful attack on our bulk power system would present significant risks to our economy, human health, and safety, and would render the United States less capable of acting in defense of itself and its allies. Further, the unrestricted acquisition or use in the United States of bulk power system electric equipment designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of foreign adversaries augments the ability of foreign adversaries to create and exploit vulnerabilities in bulk power system electric equipment with potentially catastrophic effects. The executive order recognizes that although maintaining an open investment climate in bulk power system electric equipment and in the United States economy more generally is important for the overall growth and prosperity of the United States, such openness must be balanced with the need to protect the United States against a critical national security threat. The executive order stated that to address this threat, additional steps are required to protect the security, integrity, and reliability of bulk power system electric equipment used in the United States. EO 13920 requires the Department of Energy to issue regulations by September 28, 2020 to implement the prohibition of the acquisition, importation, transfer, or installation of any bulk power system electric equipment by any person or with respect to any property subject to U.S. jurisdiction that is, quote, designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of a foreign adversary, close quote, if the Secretary of Energy determines that the transaction poses undue or unacceptable risks. The Department of Energy is also authorized to design or negotiate measures to mitigate identified risk and provides that a transaction or class of transactions may be approved subject to mitigating conditions. The Secretary is also authorized to establish criteria for pre-qualifying equipment and vendors in the bulk power system electric equipment market. The order applies to transactions initiated after May 1st, 2020. The executive order defines bulk power system to mean two things. One, facilities and control systems necessary for operating an interconnected electric energy transmission network or any portion thereof. And two, electric energy from generation facilities needed to maintain transmission reliability. The definition includes transmission lines rated at 69,000 volts or more, but does not include facilities used in the local distribution of electric energy. The term bulk power system electric equipment means items used in bulk power system substations, control rooms, or power generating stations, including reactors, capacitors, substation transformers, current coupling capacitors, large generators, backup generators, substation voltage regulators, shunt capacitor equipment, automatic circuit reclosers, instrument transformers, coupling capacity voltage transformers, protective relaying, metering equipment, high voltage circuit breakers, generation turbines, industrial control systems, distributed control systems, and safety instrumented systems. Notwithstanding the definitions of bulk power system and bulk power system electric equipment, the executive order itself does not provide specific guidance on how to determine whether specific facilities or equipment are, quote, needed to maintain transmission system reliability, quote, or are, quote, necessary for operating an interconnected electric energy transmission system, close quote. Presumably, the rules to be promulgated by the Department of Energy will help explain how to determine whether a facility or equipment is bulk power system equipment. So that wraps up today's discussion, which is lengthy and complicated. There's obviously a lot going on with respect to foreign investment and national security. I expect we'll be back for additional discussions as things continue to develop.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for listening to S&C Critical Insights. For more information about our practice, please visit us on the web at www.sulcrom.com.